Oh, sweet lesbian love between a female inmate and a female police officer in prison. Lesbian love. The first time Officer Maya Chen saw inmate number 47283 through the reinforced glass of the processing room, she felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with protocol or professionalism. The woman standing there in orange prison-issued clothing had eyes that told a story of survival, of mistakes made in desperation, and of a soul that hadn't yet given up on finding light in the darkest of places. Her name was Riley Morrison, 28 years old, convicted of theft and fraud, charges that stemmed from trying to save her dying mother from medical debt. Maya had read the file 3 times before. Riley's arrival at Riverside, women's correctional facility, each time feeling her heart break a little more at the tragedy of circumstance that had led this intelligent, compassionate woman behind bars. As Riley lifted her gaze and their eyes met for the first time, Maya felt the foundations of her carefully constructed emotional walls begin to crumble, and she knew in that instant that her life was about to become infinitely more complicated. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of love to transform even the darkest situations, please like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to channel name for more stories that will touch your soul and remind you of the beauty of human connection. Maya had been working at Riverside for 6 years, ever since she graduated from the police academy, with honors and a determination to make a difference in the criminal justice system. She had seen hundreds of inmates come through those gates, heard countless stories of poverty, addiction, abuse, and poor choices made in moments of desperation. She had trained herself to maintain professional distance, to see the inmates as her responsibility but not her concern, beyond their safety and rehabilitation within the facility's programs. She had built walls around her heart because caring too much in a place like this could break you, could leave you questioning everything you believed about justice and fairness, and the way society treated its most vulnerable members. But something about Riley was different from the very beginning, something that slipped past all of Maya's defenses and lodged itself deep in her consciousness where it refused to be ignored or rationalized away. During Riley's first week at Riverside, Maya found herself volunteering for shifts that would bring her into contact with the new intake wing. She told herself it was because she wanted to ensure the transition process was going smoothly, that she was simply being thorough in her duties as a senior corrections officer. But the truth was harder to admit and impossible to deny. She wanted to see Riley again, to observe her from a distance, to understand what it was about this particular woman that had affected her so profoundly. She watched as Riley navigated the complex social hierarchies of prison, life with quiet dignity, never seeking conflict but never backing down when challenged. She saw how Riley spent her free time in the prison library, devouring books on business and finance as if preparing for a future she still believed she could have. She noticed the way Riley's face would soften when she received letters from her younger sister, the only family member who still maintained contact, and how she would sometimes sit on her bunk with her eyes closed, clearly fighting back tears she refused to let fall in front of the other inmates. 3 months into Riley's sentence, Maya was assigned to supervise the education wing where Riley had enrolled in a college correspondence program. The small classroom, where inmates could study and complete their coursework, became the space where Maya's carefully maintained professional distance finally shattered beyond repair. It started with small conversations about the books Riley was reading, brief exchanges about her coursework in business administration, moments of connection that felt like stolen treasures in the rigid structure of prison routine. Maya found herself sharing things she had never discussed with anyone at work, talking about her own journey through college as a first-generation immigrant, her parents' sacrifice to give her opportunities they had never had, her complicated feelings about working in a system she sometimes found herself questioning. Riley listened with an intensity that made Maya feel truly seen for the first time in years, asking thoughtful questions and offering perspectives that revealed a brilliant mind trapped in circumstances that seemed cruelly unjust. The turning point came on a cold November evening when Maya found Riley sitting alone in the library long after the other inmates had returned to their cells. Her face was streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to hide, and in her hands she clutched a letter that trembled with the force of her grief. Maya should have simply escorted her back to her cell and filed a report about the violation of library hours. Instead, she found herself sitting down across from Riley, her voice soft as she asked what had happened. The words that poured out of Riley were raw and broken, explaining that her mother had passed away 3 days ago and the funeral had been held that morning. Because of her incarceration, Riley hadn't been granted permission to attend, hadn't been able to say goodbye to the woman she had committed crimes trying to save, hadn't been able to hold her sister as they grieved together. The guilt and pain in Riley's voice as she described how her mother had died believing her daughter was a criminal, never knowing the full story of the medical debt and the desperate choices that had seemed like the only option at the time, broke something open in Maya's chest that she had been trying so hard to keep closed. What Maya did next violated every rule in the corrections officer handbook and crossed boundaries she had sworn never to approach. She reached across the table and took Riley's hand in hers, feeling the warmth of another person's skin for the first time in the sterile environment of the prison, and she held it as Riley's carefully controlled composure finally crumbled completely. They sat like that for nearly 20 minutes, Maya's thumb tracing small circles on the back of Riley's hand while tears fell freely down both their faces. Two women from completely different sides of the law enforcement system finding unexpected comfort in a moment of shared humanity. When Maya finally had to escort Riley back to her cell, neither of them spoke about what had happened, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They both knew they had crossed a line, and they both knew there was no going back to the professional distance that had existed before. The months that followed were a careful dance of stolen moments and meaningful glances, of conversations that said everything without speaking the words that could never be spoken aloud within the prison walls. Maya began to arrange her schedule so that she worked the shifts when Riley would be in the education wing or the library. She found small ways to make Riley's life easier within the constraints of the system, recommending her for work programs that would look good on parole applications, ensuring she was assigned to cell blocks with less violence and more stability. Riley, for her part, excelled in every program she was offered, determined to transform her time in prison into preparation for the future she was fighting to build. She tutored other inmates who struggled with literacy, organized a book club in the library, and became a quiet leader among the women who were working toward genuine rehabilitation rather than simply serving time. But beneath all this productive activity, both women were acutely aware of the growing emotional connection between them, the way their hearts raced when they caught sight of each other, the way their conversations seemed to exist in a bubble separate from the harsh reality of their surroundings. The situation became even more complicated when Maya realized she wasn't just developing feelings of compassion or friendship for Riley. She was falling in love, deeply and completely in a way she had never experienced before. Maya had dated casually over the years, had even had a few serious relationships with other women, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of what she felt for Riley. It was a love that grew in the spaces between words, in the shared understanding of two people who saw each other's true selves beneath the roles they were forced to play. It was also a love that was completely impossible, forbidden by every law and regulation that governed Maya's profession, dangerous to both of them in ways that kept Maya awake at night staring at her ceiling and questioning every choice she was making. She knew she should request a transfer to a different facility, should distance herself before the situation spiraled beyond her control, but the thought of not seeing Riley every day, of not being there to protect her in the small ways she could, felt like a loss she couldn't bear to accept. Riley's feelings were equally complicated and even more dangerous to acknowledge. She had entered prison expecting to serve her 3-year sentence in survival mode, keeping her head down and counting the days until she could return to her sister and attempt to rebuild some version of a normal life. She had not expected to meet someone like Maya, someone whose kindness felt like water in a desert, whose smile could transform the bleakest day into something bearable. Riley had known she was attracted to women since high school, though she had never been in a relationship that felt truly meaningful before her incarceration. What she felt for Maya went so far beyond physical attraction that it sometimes took her breath away. It was the way Maya looked at her like she was a person, rather than just an inmate number. The way she seemed to genuinely believe in Riley's potential for redemption and transformation. But Riley also understood the impossible position they were in. The way any relationship between them would be seen as a violation of trust and an abuse of power. The devastating consequences Maya would face if anyone discovered the depth of their connection. So they continued their careful dance, saying everything with their eyes that they could never say aloud, finding meaning in the smallest gestures and the briefest moments of privacy. The crisis that forced everything into the open came during Riley's 18th month of incarceration. A violent altercation broke out in the recreation yard between rival groups of inmates, and Riley found herself caught in the middle simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maya heard the alarm and ran toward the yard with her heart in her throat, arriving to find Riley pinned against a fence by an inmate twice her size, who had mistaken her for someone from an opposing faction. Without thinking about protocol or backup or anything except protecting the woman she loved, Maya physically threw herself between them, taking a blow to the face that split her lip and left her tasting blood. The riot response team arrived within minutes and separated everyone involved. But not before Maya's fierce protection of Riley had been witnessed by a dozen other officers and twice as many inmates. As Maya was escorted to the medical wing to have her injuries assessed, she could see the questions in her colleagues' eyes, the speculation that would follow about why she had reacted so strongly to protect one particular inmate. The investigation that followed was inevitable and thorough. The warden called Maya into her office the next day and asked direct questions about her relationship with inmate Morrison, questions that Maya answered with as much honesty as she could, without completely destroying her career or putting Riley at risk. She admitted that she had developed personal concern for Riley beyond what was professionally appropriate, that she had perhaps shown favoritism in small ways, but she denied any physical relationship or explicit romantic involvement. The warden was not entirely convinced, but without concrete evidence of misconduct and given Maya's otherwise exemplary record, she issued a formal warning and mandatory transfer to a different facility, rather than termination. Maya had 2 weeks to complete the transition, 2 weeks to say goodbye to the woman who had become the center of her emotional universe, 2 weeks to figure out how to live with a heart that felt like it was being torn in half. Riley heard about the transfer through the prison grapevine before Maya could tell her directly. The news hit her like a physical blow, leaving her dizzy with the realization of how much she had come to depend on Maya's presence in her daily life. That evening, when Maya came to the library where she knew Riley would be studying, they looked at each other with eyes full of everything they had never been able to say. Maya spoke first, her voice thick with emotion, explaining that she had been reassigned, but that she had also done something that could cost her everything if anyone found out. She had reached out to a lawyer friend and arranged for Riley's case to be reviewed, had funded a private investigator to look into the circumstances of her conviction, had set in motion a process that might lead to an appeal or early parole based on the extenuating circumstances of her mother's medical situation. She told Riley that she couldn't be part of her life in the way she desperately wanted to be, not while Riley was incarcerated and not while the power imbalance between them was so stark. But she also told her, with tears streaming down her face, that she loved her, that she had never felt this way about anyone before, that if Riley could find a way to earn her freedom and rebuild her life, Maya would be waiting for her in whatever capacity Riley would accept. Riley's response came in a whisper that carried the weight of everything she had been holding inside for 18 months. She told Maya that she loved her too, that Maya had given her hope when she thought she had none left, that the thought of Maya out there, somewhere believing in her, would be what got her through the remainder of her sentence. They both knew they couldn't make promises about a future that was so uncertain, couldn't plan for a relationship that might never be possible, but they also knew that what they had found together was real and rare and worth fighting for. even if the fight had to happen separately and from a distance. They sat together in the library until the final moment before lockdown, not touching because the security cameras were always watching, but connected in ways that transcended the physical space between them. When Maya finally had to leave, she turned back once at the doorway and found Riley's eyes across the room. And in that look, they exchanged a promise that neither of them spoke aloud, but both of them understood. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just a painful chapter in a narrative that might someday find its way to hope. The months after Maya's transfer were the hardest of Riley's life. Without Maya's daily presence as an anchor point, the prison felt grayer and more oppressive than it ever had before. But Riley channeled her grief and longing into fierce determination, throwing herself into her studies and rehabilitation programs with renewed intensity. She worked with the lawyer Maya had connected her with, providing documentation and testimony for an appeal based on inadequate legal representation during her original trial and the extenuating circumstances that had led to her crimes. She maintained perfect behavior, earned commendations from every program supervisor, and built a record of transformation that even the most skeptical parole board members would have to acknowledge. And every night before she slept, she thought about Maya somewhere out there in the world, carrying on with her own life, but hopefully still holding space for the possibility of them. Maya's new assignment at a juvenile detention facility was meant to be a fresh start, but she found it impossible to move on from Riley. She kept herself informed about the appeal process through her lawyer friend, celebrated silently when she heard that Riley's case had been granted a review, and nearly stopped breathing when the news came that Riley's sentence had been commuted based on procedural irregularities in her trial and her exceptional record during incarceration. Riley would be released after serving just over 2 years instead of the full 3-year sentence, a small victory in the face of a justice system that had failed her, but a victory nonetheless. The day of Riley's release, Maya drove to Riverside and waited in the parking lot across from the prison entrance, her hands shaking on the steering wheel as she watched the doors where Riley would emerge. When Riley finally walked out into the sunlight as a free woman, blinking against the brightness, after so many months of fluorescent lights and gray walls, she scanned the parking lot with obvious purpose. Her eyes found Maya's car, and her entire face transformed with a smile that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. Riley walked toward the car with steady purpose, and when she opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, they simply looked at each other for a long moment filled with everything they had survived to reach this point. Maya spoke first, her voice shaking as she asked if Riley still felt what they had discovered in those stolen moments behind prison walls. If the feelings that had sustained them through separation were still real in the freedom of the outside world. Riley's answer came not in words but in action, as she leaned across the console and kissed Maya with a tenderness that spoke of patience and hope and a future they could finally begin to build together. The road ahead of them would not be easy. Riley had to rebuild her life from scratch, finding employment despite her criminal record, repairing her relationship with her sister, and processing the trauma of both her mother's death and her incarceration. Maya had to navigate the complicated ethics of a relationship that had begun in such problematic circumstances, working through her own guilt, and the judgment of colleagues who learned about their connection. But they faced these challenges together, with the kind of honest communication and deep understanding that had been forged in the most unlikely of places. Riley enrolled in a university to complete her business degree in person rather than through correspondence, worked part-time at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated women reintegrate into society, and slowly built the kind of life she had dreamed about during her darkest moments in prison. Maya continued her work in corrections with a new perspective, becoming an advocate for criminal justice reform and the kind of rehabilitation programs that had helped Riley transform her life. 2 years after Riley's release, on a beach at sunset with waves crashing in the background and stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Maya dropped to one knee and asked Riley to marry her. The ring she offered was simple but meaningful, a symbol of the commitment they had already made to each other through all the obstacles they had faced. Riley said yes through tears of joy, pulling Maya to her feet and kissing her with the freedom and openness they had never been able to show during those prison years. They had found love in the most unexpected and forbidden of circumstances. Head nurture.